I forgot to tell my son that I called a technician to fix the security camera. That single oversight changed everything. 1 week later, when I finally checked the footage, I froze. My son wasn't alone in the frame. My daughter-in-law was there too. The way they moved, the words I read on their lips, the sharpness in their faces, it wasn't love I saw. It was conspiracy, a dark secret unfolding inside the walls of my own home, captured in clear detail. My name is Charles Warren, 70 years old, retired electrician. I've spent most of my life building, repairing, and documenting. I don't miss much, but when I do, I make sure I never repeat the mistake. That night, as I sat at my desk, the monitor glowing cold in the dark, I knew what I'd stumbled onto wasn't small. The technician had fixed the camera quietly, no fuss, just reconnected wires and reset the system. I'd almost forgotten about it, until that evening, when boredom pushed me to scroll through the recordings. I didn't expect to find betrayal woven into the silence of my own living room. My son, David, 36, husband, father of two, a man I'd raised to believe in responsibility. My daughter-in-law, Rebecca, younger by a few years, quiet, polite. Together, they presented a picture of stability. But the camera doesn't lie. It sees what people think is hidden. And what I saw shattered the image I'd carried of them both. I didn't shout. I didn't rush upstairs. I didn't even call their names. I sat still, staring at the screen, letting the silence fill the room. My hands were steady, my breathing controlled. Shock is noise. Strategy is silence. I rewound the footage. Played it again. This wasn't an accident or misunderstanding. It was planned. Coordinated. I watched as they handled something they shouldn't have had, documents, boxes, things that didn't belong in my house. Their whispers turned into sharp exchanges, and Rebecca's hand shook as she passed something to David. He tucked it under his arm like contraband. 10 minutes later, the worst happened. Not outside. Not on the street. Inside my own home. A sound on the footage I hadn't heard with my own ears that night. A door forced. A drawer opened. The subtle scrape of metal against wood. They hadn't just hidden something. They'd taken something from me. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor still painting my face. My house had become a stage, my family the actors, the camera the silent witness. I didn't confront them. I didn't even move. Instead, I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote 3 words, the same ones I'd used all my life when problems arose. Watch. Record. Wait. Because some secrets burn louder than confessions. And mine had just begun to smolder. The footage looped in my head long after the screen went dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the old house settling. Every sound carried weight now. The silence between the walls was no longer peace. It was pressure. In the morning, I watched David come downstairs, his shirt tucked in, his tie knotted perfectly, like a man who had nothing to hide. Rebecca followed minutes later, quiet as always, her eyes downcast, her smile rehearsed. They ate breakfast like any other couple, like the footage hadn't already betrayed them. I didn't say a word. My silence was deliberate, heavier than confrontation. People reveal themselves when you leave them space. They fill the quiet with their own guilt. After they left for work, I returned to the footage. I slowed it down, frame by frame. Their lips moved fast, but I could read fragments. Words like risk, papers, and don't tell him. My name wasn't spoken, but I didn't need it. I was the shadow in their secret, the silent presence they'd overlooked. I opened my notebook, the same one I'd used for decades. I wrote the date, the time, the words I'd read. Then I underlined them twice. Documentation builds weight. 1 line alone means nothing. 10 lines become a burden. 50 lines can break a man. Later that day, I checked the drawer they'd touched. Locked when I left it, now slightly misaligned. Inside, some of my documents were missing, old contracts, financial statements, records that tied me to properties they knew nothing about. They hadn't just taken papers. They'd taken leverage. That evening, I listened carefully as they returned home. Rebecca's laugh was forced, brittle. David's footsteps were heavy, each one landing like he carried more than his briefcase. They ate dinner with me, speaking of work and weather. Their words were casual, their eyes were not. I stayed quiet. My fork against the plate was the only sound I gave them. Silence at a dinner table is louder than any accusation. That night, after they went upstairs, I checked the camera again. More footage, more whispers. Rebecca handed David an envelope. His hands trembled when he took it. He tucked it under his jacket before heading toward the garage. The camera didn't catch where he went next, but it didn't need to. I already knew. By midnight, I had filled 3 pages in my notebook. Times, movements, items taken, patterns forming. I wasn't angry. Anger is messy. What I felt was colder, sharper, calculation. Because they thought the camera was broken. They thought the house was blind. They forgot who built this house. And who always watches. The next morning, I started setting my own traps. Not the kind that snap shut with noise, but the kind that waits silently, gathering weight until the right moment. I moved a folder of documents from the drawer they had already searched and placed it in the cabinet by the garage. I left the lock slightly loose, the key visible on a hook they both knew I rarely used. It wasn't bait for money. It was bait for truth. When I checked the footage later, the pattern unfolded as expected. Rebecca entered the garage first, glancing over her shoulder twice before lifting the key. Her movements were precise, her hands practiced. She unlocked the cabinet and rifled through the papers. Minutes later, David joined her. They whispered quickly, his hands gesturing, hers clutching an envelope. Then they left, the key back in its place, but their silence heavier than before. I documented it all. Time, 7:46 p.m. Action, access. Result, stolen file. My notebook was no longer just a record. It was evidence, layered and undeniable. At dinner, I watched them carefully. David's shoulders were stiff, his smile too wide. Rebecca spoke little, pushing food around her plate, her fork scraping against porcelain like a nervous tick. They thought I hadn't noticed. But silence gives you sharper ears than any question ever could. That night, I copied the footage onto a flash drive. One of several. I labeled it with the date and tucked it into a small box I kept hidden under the floorboard of my study. If the worst happened, the truth would outlive me. 2 days later, the tension cracked. David came home late, his face pale, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He walked past me without a word, straight to the kitchen sink, where he splashed water on his face. Rebecca followed minutes later, her voice sharp as she told him to calm down. They argued in the hall, low and fast, but I heard enough. He knows. They weren't wrong. I did know. I had known from the first frame of footage. But knowledge without noise is more dangerous than any accusation. They didn't know what I had recorded. They didn't know how much I'd written. That evening, I moved another set of documents, old bank records, into the hall closet. Again, I loosened the lock. Again, I placed the key within reach. And again, the camera caught them taking the bait. David's hand shook when he folded the papers, Rebecca's eyes darting toward the ceiling as if she could sense the lens above her. In my notebook, I wrote, "They are digging. Let them. Because silence doesn't rush. It waits. And when the waiting ends, the collapse is absolute." By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like my own. Every drawer, every cabinet, every hallway carried their fingerprints. But they didn't know I was already mapping their movements, turning their secrets into coordinates on a page. I didn't confront them. Instead, I prepared my first delivery. One envelope, plain and unmarked, slipped into the mailbox of the local station. Inside were copies of the footage, the garage, the cabinet, the hallway. Each frame time-stamped, each detail undeniable. I didn't write my name. I didn't need to. The images spoke louder than any accusation. The next morning, David sat across from me at breakfast, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He pushed his food around, but never ate. Rebecca poured coffee, her hand trembling just enough to rattle the spoon against the cup. They didn't ask me questions, but their silence was louder than words. They could feel the weight pressing in. They just didn't know from where. That afternoon, a patrol car circled our street. Not once. Twice. Slow, deliberate. I watched from the porch, my face calm, my hands folded. David pulled back the curtain inside, his jaw tightening. Rebecca asked him something I couldn't hear, and he snapped at her. Tension was cracking through their practiced calm. I didn't move. I didn't warn. I just noted the time, the detail, the reaction. That night, I checked the cameras again. They didn't steal anything new. Instead, they argued in hushed voices, pacing the living room like caged animals. Rebecca's voice broke once, sharper, desperate. David raised his hand, not to strike, but to silence. My pen scratched across the page. Fracture. 2 days later, I set another trap. This time not documents, but a decoy envelope, blank papers sealed tight, placed in the study desk. By evening, the footage caught them again. Rebecca's fingers tore it open, her face falling when she found nothing inside. David's anger showed in the way he shoved the chair back, almost breaking it against the wall. They left the room in silence, but the camera caught the look in Rebecca's eyes, fear. The next morning, a detective knocked on the door. He didn't step inside. He just asked if I'd noticed unusual activity around the house, if I'd seen anyone suspicious. I gave him the same answer I always gave. Times, places, facts. Never feelings. Never names. He nodded once, thanked me, and left. That night, David paced the hallway for hours, his footsteps echoing against the floorboards. Rebecca sat on the couch, hands clenched, eyes fixed on nothing. They thought they were losing control. They were right. Because silence wasn't just watching anymore. Silence was closing in. By the 5th week, the walls of my house had turned into mirrors, reflecting their fear back at them. Every movement was sharper now, every whisper strained. They thought the world outside was pressing in. They didn't realize I was the one tightening the circle, one silent move at a time. Rebecca cracked first. I saw it in the footage, the way she lingered near the back door, staring out at the yard as if freedom waited there. Her hands wrung together, restless, as David spoke at her in clipped sentences. He wasn't leading anymore. He was grasping, trying to hold their plan together with frayed threads. I didn't interrupt. I documented. I copied the footage onto another drive, slid it into a second envelope, and left it where I knew it would be found, on the detective's desk at the station. Anonymous again. Silent again. By the next evening, another patrol car rolled past, slower this time, headlights off. Inside, David noticed. His face paled as he peeked through the blinds. Rebecca asked him something sharp, and he snapped back. The tension grew until silence choked them both. They didn't see me watching from my chair, pen scratching across paper, fracture widening. The following night, they argued louder. Their voices carried down the hallway. Rebecca accused, David denied. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. Trust was gone. My silence was the wedge, and it was splitting them apart without me ever lifting my voice. The next morning, I set another quiet trap. I left an old envelope in the hall closet, stuffed not with papers this time, but with a simple note. I see you. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. By evening, the footage showed Rebecca finding it. Her face drained of color. She thrust it at David, her voice cracking as she demanded answers. He stared at it for a long time, then tore it to pieces. But tearing paper doesn't erase words. It only spreads them thinner. That night, the detective returned. He didn't push for entry. He simply said they were getting close. His eyes lingered on me, searching, maybe wondering how much I really knew. I gave him nothing but silence. It was enough. Back inside, David's paranoia deepened. He searched the house, opening drawers, checking under rugs, even tapping at the walls like a man convinced someone had planted microphones. Rebecca sat on the couch, motionless, her eyes empty. They were breaking, and all I had done was wait. By midnight, I wrote the final line of the day in my notebook. Silence has become the cage. And they were already trapped inside it. By the start of the next week, the investigation outside and the silence inside were colliding. The air in the house was thick, heavy with suspicion. David and Rebecca barely spoke to me anymore, but their whispers behind closed doors were sharper, more frantic. I noticed the changes in their patterns. David stayed up late, pacing the living room long after midnight, his hands clenching and unclenching as though he was fighting ghosts. Rebecca left the house more often, always coming back with eyes red from tears. They weren't partners anymore. They were prisoners, chained together by secrets. I tightened the noose one more time. Another envelope, this one filled with photos of their late-night movements, carefully captured from the cameras. Rebecca sneaking to the garage, David checking the backyard at odd hours. The two of them meeting by the closet to whisper about documents they no longer had. I mailed it directly to the detective's office. No return address. No explanation. Just truth, silent and undeniable. 2 nights later, the knock came again. Firm, steady, not violent, but heavy enough to shake the walls. David froze at the sound. Rebecca's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against the plate. Neither of them moved until I stood and opened the door. The detective asked for David. calm voice, polite words, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. David claimed he was busy, that this was a mistake. The detective didn't argue. He just handed him a card and said they'd be in touch. When the door closed, David's face was pale as chalk. That night, the cameras showed him in the garage, frantically searching through boxes, pulling at drawers, tossing things onto the floor. He was looking for something he couldn't find, something I had already taken. My pen scratched across the page, panic stage. Rebecca sat on the stairs, watching him with hollow eyes. She didn't help. She didn't move. Her silence wasn't strength, it was surrender. She had already broken. By morning, the house felt like a battlefield, though no words were spoken. David slammed doors, stomped through rooms, muttered curses under his breath. Rebecca drifted like a ghost, silent and numb. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, notebook open. My calm was the sharpest weapon in the house, and it cut them deeper than shouting ever could. That evening, a second patrol car passed the house. Slowly. Lights off. David noticed. He stood at the window for a long time, breathing hard, his hand gripping the curtain. Rebecca whispered something sharp behind him. He turned and shouted, his voice cracking, before storming out of the room. I wrote one more line. Desperation has arrived. And desperation always makes mistakes. Desperation changes a person. It makes them loud, erratic, reckless. And I had learned long ago that the louder a man becomes, the easier he is to predict. David's desperation arrived in small bursts at first. He tore through the garage, muttered curses under his breath, slammed doors with the force of a man trying to drown out his own thoughts. But when silence met him at every turn, when no answers came, the bursts turned into storms. Rebecca weathered them in silence, but not the kind I used. Hers was fragile, the silence of someone who had already surrendered. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from, her eyes fixed on the floor. When David shouted, she didn't shout back. She just absorbed the sound until it broke her down piece by piece. I documented everything. The hours he stayed out, the calls he made in whispers, the way he checked the windows twice before leaving the house. Each detail went into the notebook, each page becoming heavier than the last. Silence isn't passive, it's accumulation, and I was stacking weight on their shoulders every day. One evening, I caught it on camera, David and Rebecca meeting in the driveway. She tried to hand him something small, folded tight, but he pushed it back into her hands. His face twisted with anger, his mouth forming words I didn't need to hear to understand. This is your fault. I wrote it down. The fracture wasn't widening anymore. It was breaking. 2 days later, the police came again. This time not with questions, but with presence. 2 patrol cars parked at the end of the street, lights off, officers leaning against their vehicles, watching. They didn't knock, didn't approach, just waited. The neighborhood noticed. Curtains moved, whispers spread. Inside, David's panic was unmistakable. He paced the living room like a trapped animal, his hands clawing through his hair. Rebecca followed him with her eyes, her lips pressed tight, her body rigid. He turned on her once, his fingers stabbing the air as he accused her of betrayal. She didn't respond. She just walked away, leaving him to rage alone. That night, he tried something new. He left the house at 3 a.m., hood pulled low, his car moving without headlights for the first mile. But I had already placed a camera near the end of the street, hidden in plain sight. It caught his direction, his license plate, his exact time of departure. By dawn, the footage was already copied, sealed, and prepared for delivery. In my notebook, I wrote the line that mattered most. His silence is gone. Mine remains. And soon, only one of us would be left standing in it. By the 8th week, the silence I had built was no longer just mine. It had spread beyond these walls, pressing down from every direction. The police didn't need to knock anymore. Their presence alone was enough. 2 cars on the street, officers watching from a distance, neighbors whispering behind blinds. David and Rebecca were living in a cage they couldn't see but could feel closing tighter every day. David tried to fight it. He stormed through the house at odd hours, throwing open drawers, flipping through papers, demanding answers from the air itself. He searched my study twice, convinced I had hidden something from him. He didn't realize I wanted him to search. I wanted him to feel the weight of my silence in every empty drawer, every locked cabinet. Rebecca grew quieter, but not with strength. She sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the walls like they might confess before she did. Sometimes I caught her glancing at me, her eyes filled with questions she would never dare ask. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how deep it ran. That night, the camera caught David leaving again. His car rolled silently down the street, headlights off, before disappearing into the distance. Hours later, he returned with mud on his shoes and rage in his eyes. Rebecca tried to speak to him at the door, but he shoved past her, his jaw tight, his silence louder than shouting. By morning, I had already copied the footage. Another envelope. Another silent message. No words attached. Just truth. Later that day, the detective came by. His tone was sharper now, more direct. He asked if I'd noticed unusual activity at night, if I'd heard the car leaving, if I'd seen David with anyone unfamiliar. I answered with what I always gave. Times, places, facts. He nodded, satisfied, though his eyes lingered on me as though he suspected I knew more. He wasn't wrong. That evening, the pressure inside the house reached a breaking point. David shouted in the kitchen, his voice carrying through the walls. Rebecca's replies were quiet, desperate, barely audible. Then came the sound of something shattering, glass against tile. I didn't move from my chair. I just wrote the time down, 9:42 p.m. The silence that followed was heavier than the argument. Rebecca retreated upstairs. David stayed in the kitchen, pacing back and forth, muttering words I couldn't hear. The camera above the doorway caught every step, every twitch, every crack in the mask he still tried to wear. When midnight came, I closed my notebook. I didn't need to write anymore. The silence was carrying more weight than my words ever could. Because silence, when used long enough, stops being absence. It becomes judgment. And judgment was already here. The 9th week began with silence from the outside world, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. The patrol cars no longer circled. The officers no longer lingered. And that absence was louder than their presence had ever been. David noticed first. He stared through the blinds for hours, waiting for the red and blue lights to return. When they didn't, he grew restless. His pacing turned into storms, his whispers into shouts. Rebecca tried to calm him, but her voice was weak, breaking at the edges. She was unraveling too, and he knew it. That night, the cameras caught what silence finally forced out. Rebecca, sitting at the dining table, her head in her hands. David standing over her, his voice sharp, his fingers stabbing the air. She flinched, but didn't respond. Then, in a single sentence, she broke. Her lips formed the words, "I can't do this anymore." I wrote it down. Not in anger, not in victory, but as a record. Fracture complete. Hours later, David left again. This time he didn't bother with headlights off. He slammed the door, revved the engine, and tore down the street like he wanted the world to chase him. He didn't understand. The world was already waiting. When he returned near dawn, a second car followed him. Not police. Strangers. The cameras caught them pulling into the driveway, their shapes hunched, their movements sharp. They spoke to him in low, clipped tones before handing him a small box. He carried it inside like it weighed more than stone. Rebecca saw, her face drained of color, her lips trembling as she asked him something I couldn't hear. He didn't answer. He shoved past her, clutching the box tight, disappearing into the garage. I copied the footage, sealed it in another envelope, and delivered it to the station before sunrise. This time I didn't wait days. I wanted the silence to break fast, to fall heavy. By afternoon, the detective arrived. His voice was firmer, his eyes sharper. He asked if David was home. I told him no, because he wasn't. He asked if Rebecca was. She was upstairs, motionless, her silence more damning than any confession. The detective nodded once, thanked me, and left. That evening, the police cars returned. Not two this time, four. They parked at both ends of the street, boxing in the house. Officers moved quietly, strategically, their presence undeniable. Rebecca wept in the hallway. David froze in the garage when the first knock came. I sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen resting on the page. I didn't write. I didn't need to. The silence had already spoken, and what it said was final. The knock came again, harder this time, steady and relentless. David didn't move. He stood in the garage clutching the box, his eyes darting toward the door as if escape might still exist. Rebecca sat on the stairs, her face pale, her hands trembling against her knees. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was surrender. I stayed at the kitchen table. The notebook lay open before me, pages filled with weeks of quiet observation. Every line, every timestamp, every detail, each one a nail in the coffin they had built with their own hands. I didn't add to it. I didn't cross anything out. My work was done. The front door opened under the weight of the officer's command. They moved quickly, professionally, filling the house with presence but not chaos. Their voices were firm, their movements controlled. They passed me without questions. They weren't here for me. Rebecca was the first to break. She stood, her shoulders sagging, her eyes brimming with tears. She didn't resist when they guided her outside. Her silence had become confession. David was different. He shouted once, loud and wild, clutching the box tighter like it held his salvation. But the noise didn't save him. It betrayed him. Within seconds, they had him pinned, his voice cut off, his body restrained. The box slipped from his hands, falling to the concrete with a hollow thud. Its sound echoed through the house like a final judgment. When they let him out, he turned once, his eyes locking on me. There was no plea, no apology, just realization. He understood now. He understood that the silence he had mistaken for weakness had been watching him the entire time. The house emptied in minutes. The flashing lights painted the walls red and blue, then faded into the distance. The street quieted, the neighbors retreated from their windows, and the silence returned heavier than ever. I sat there for a long time, the pen still resting on the last line I had written. Finally, I closed the notebook. For weeks, silence had been my weapon, my shield, my strategy. Now it was my ending. I didn't hate them. Hate is loud, and loudness has no place in my house. What I felt was colder. Final. Like closing a door that should never have been opened. The truth doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It waits, patient and steady, until the weight of silence crushes the lies beneath it. And in the end, that was all I needed. Silence. My silence. Because some men fight with words, some with fists. I fought with silence. And silence won. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.